Donald Trump is going to win by more in 2020 than he did in 2016.
From Sky News, this is Divided States.
No country on earth spends as much on healthcare as the United States, but all that money leaves millions without care.
In Oklahoma, they have to fly abortion providers in.
Twice as many people killed by guns than in combat in the Iraq and Afghanistan wars.
We've gotten to a place very far from our founding fathers.
Welcome to Divided States. I'm Amanda Walker. It has been an astonishing week in America. Just as we were taking the first tentative steps out of coronavirus lockdown, a video emerged that hit the country at its very core, showing the death of another black man in the custody of a white police officer. It has ignited a movement that is difficult to compare. We've crashed from one nightmare into another, and there's no end in sight. Over the past few days, we've seen America's major cities burning, protests from coast to coast that have often ended in violence and chaos. But behind it, a huge amount of national anguish and despair. There is one name at the heart of all of this, George Floyd. But in a matter of days, it's become about so much more. It feels as though everyone in America is asking themselves questions about their own identity, even questioning the foundations on which this society is built. Now, it's been an intense few days. There's a lot to unpack and talk about. Cordelia Lynch and Emily Purser-Brown are here kind of with me now via screens and audio and every which way we can at the moment. You've both been out in the protests in the last few days, survived them. How are you doing?
Okay, yeah, a bit frazzled. It's been an intense moment, hasn't it?
Yeah, it's always hard. It's a hard story to cover, and it's a hard moment to live through as a person as well, isn't it? Really quite a reckoning at the moment.
Yeah, it just keeps coming, doesn't it? Let's start at the beginning. It's a moment we're all now familiar with. Last Monday, just over a week ago, 46-year-old African-American man was taken into police custody in the street in South Minneapolis. He was pushed to the floor and held there for 8 minutes and 46 seconds. The knee of a white police officer on his neck. And in that time, he died. Floyd struggled for 5 minutes, telling the police officers that he couldn't breathe, even calling out for his mother, who passed away last year. It was primal, it was gut-wrenching, hard to listen to watch, but crucial for everyone to take notice of. And it brings to mind all the times this has happened when there isn't a camera recording. The knee of the police officer in question, Derek Chauvin, remained on Floyd's neck for 2 minutes and 53 seconds after he became unresponsive, and bystanders were calling out to him to stop. It was just an unbelievable scene. Cordy, it's a personal tragedy, isn't it? But it's had national consequences for the entirety of America. It feels like has been impacted in some way by this. Just give us a sense of how the protests sparked off from that devastating moment.
Yeah, it has really grown and ignited outrage that spread, but has also been really sustained. From beginning in Minneapolis, where, of course, George Floyd was from, we saw it go to many cities, dozens, people taking to the streets, expressing their indignation at two viruses that have long plagued America. You've got both racism, great social inequity in this society, and police brutality. And that video and George Floyd's demise at the hands of the police, I think captured a moment in time when this country feels deeply divided. People are exasperated. They've been here far too many times and they want dramatic change.
No justice, no peace! No justice, no peace!
It's not just about George Floyd, it's about everybody.
It's about every single black person in this country who has been systematically oppressed. So this is the overflow of the things that we've been talking about for the last, 70 years? People think that after civil rights things have ended, and it hasn't.
Well, we're getting tired. We're tired of seeing our black people die every day. You see me, you see the pain in my eyes? I'm tired of it. I'm tired of it. I'm tired.
Many also feel that they are living under the leadership of a man who is fanning the flames of hate, and they want it to stop. And so we saw the likes of LA, Georgia, Minnesota, of course, but small towns as well as cities across the country try to vent their fury. There were lots of elements to it, and I'm sure we'll get into that later. But at the core of it all was a kind of outrage that I think we haven't seen in quite this way for very many years.
Yeah, it's a cocktail, isn't it? And the kind of ingredients that have gone into it has just been explosive. It began in Minneapolis, which as a city seemed to go on a real journey of grief to violence, back to grief. Emily, you were there. You were in the middle of it. What was the mood? How did people talk to you? What was it like?
Well, as you say, people really went on a journey there themselves. I think Minneapolis led the country and how it responded, and it became clear from what was happening in that city in the first few days what might then spread across the nation, and it did. There was a profound moment of grief at the beginning, and then anger sort of boiled over very quickly. And I think in those days in which the public and the wider community in America were waiting for action from the police against their own officers, actually, they were waiting for that officer at the heart of this, Derek Chauvin, to be arrested. It all spilt over quite dramatically. And in those, at the end of last week, those sort of long, getting to be hot summer nights, there was a lot of violence. And you saw not just people who came out trying to honor the name of George Floyd and affect change through their protests, but also some opportunism, frankly. When I rolled up in the middle of the night on, I think it was Friday, I saw, pickup trucks just wheeling into the back of a smashed up liquor store. And they're just people going in to get like crates of vodka out just to kind of go shopping for free. Kids setting places on fire, just arson across the city, Wells Fargo Bank, the post office, institutions in the community. And most devastatingly, a lot of small family-run businesses that are actually owned by the minority communities. And it really, in that way and in that moment, it was highly depressing. And then actually in the days that followed,
which businesses that were on their knees already, right, because of the pandemic.
Yeah, and we should talk about the way that those businesses will cope, because really I think that is another victim in this story so far. But it was interesting that within Minneapolis, having seen that, the authorities there then decided to come down extremely hard, and we'll talk about the way that the federal forces have been deployed here on this, across America. The National Guard came in, they got in there on the Saturday and the Sunday night, they stopped the violence. And now it seems to me the city seems to have gone back to being able to unite in that grief, maybe slightly more positive way forward.
So that was the kind of hub, if you like, and it spread across the country like wildfire, didn't it? It's been quite something. 75 towns and cities protesting. Nighttime curfews largely ignored across the country. In many places, it seemed to turn from protest about George Floyd's death into something certainly more destructive, more violent, particularly at nighttime. And even here in Washington, D.C., where we all live and we all agree, we feel pretty safe here most of the time, don't we? I'm actually down at the protest site here right now in the car, looking out. There's sunshine, there's people gathering around. It's, very peaceful at the moment. It was not peaceful on Monday night. Cordy, what was your city, your home like?
Well, unlike we've ever seen it. As you say, it's calm, it's controlled. It's a really rules-based, kind of rules-obsessed city, isn't it? And of course, it's the seat of power, so protests are not unusual in Washington, D.C. Everything is often so controlled by police, naturally. This is the place where the president resides.
But never in a heavy-handed way, right?
No, never in this kind of muscular, aggressive, confrontational way. At the beginning, just before curfew, after 6 o'clock, I think it was around about 6:30, there was this big kerfuffle Within this peaceful protest, people have been holding vigil outside the White House, trying to get their voices heard. And then suddenly you saw police in riot gear move in very aggressively, actually
without warning, right?
Without warning, started pushing people out, trying to move them along. You saw, TV reporters live on air being pushed to the sides. A camera crew was hit, and then everybody kind of engulfed in this smoke. There's some debate about whether tear gas was dispersed or not. Many that were there that experienced those moments says they're convinced tear gas was used. And later we see the president emerge, this extraordinary political moment, making his way, and I'm sure we'll get into that moment outside the church. But largely, for most of the evening, it was calm. The police had got their strategy sorted. Roads were blocked. The protesters couldn't go anywhere. But later on, at about midnight, it was a dramatic shift. I saw the city looking like a war zone, and we were caught up in it. We saw guys running into a pharmacy, coming out. I guess the police assumed that they were looting. We didn't see them holding anything when they came out. But then there were rubber bullets being fired instantly, tear gas everywhere. We were pretty blindsided by that. It was very difficult to see, really stung our eyes. It was crazy, this kind of incongruous sight of National Guard surrounding the Apple store there, just a couple of blocks from the White House. I couldn't believe what we were seeing.
And Emily, we've all covered these things, haven't we? But I don't know, I've had a sense, whether it's here or Russia or, wherever it is, that the police, I don't know, there's not a respect often, but there's an acknowledgement that you are a member of the press and that you can, record what you're seeing. But here, you saw members of the press and the media being targeted.
Yeah, it was weird on Monday night, actually. I'd come off the plane from Minneapolis, where it was beginning to get under control, and trying to get to Cordelia and our cameraman. And it was like a sort of police state with the cordons around, a large area around the White House, and absolutely no love lost, as you say, between the cops and the press. In the last week, there have been now quite a long list of moments where the police have do we use the word targeted, or have found a way to injure or disrespect the job that journalists are doing. You're right that there is normally respect there.
Yeah, I think we've got to be careful with the word, haven't we? I think what we've seen, for example, with the CNN reporter who was arrested on air, it was very clear to the police there that he was a member of the media, yet still that happened. Now, whether you call that targeting or not, you have very visibly obvious members of the media and journalists who are being treated like protesters. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think my view on it is that I don't think particularly press were being targeted per se, but I think that police in Minneapolis, at least from what I saw, didn't care to distinguish between the police and the protesters. Like a member of the press lost her eye in Minneapolis last Friday night because she was shot, in close range with a rubber bullet. That's quite shocking stuff. But there is a difficult relationship right now between the police and everybody who appears to be standing against them. And I think sometimes journalists have been caught up in the melee in the last few days.
Yeah, let's talk about the protesters. They're obviously at the heart of this. And guess what? The issue of who the protesters are has become a political one in America. Who would have thought it? You've got, during the day, I think that the general tone is peaceful. You see people of all ethnicities and ages who are out, who are heartbroken a lot of the time. And then, as we've mentioned, things turn pretty different in the evening sometimes. Now they're being labelled as anarchists, left-wing extremists, right-wing extremists, you name it. Who are the protesters? Who have you guys been speaking to and encountering?
A mixture, quite frankly. Sometimes it's not that easy to actually get to speak to people because you're in the melee of stuff and things start moving really quickly. But on Sunday night, you saw the kind of peripheral troublemakers, I guess you could broadly describe them as, who were kind of seemed there out of frustration, smashing up buildings, setting Secret Service vehicles on fire. There was a slight air of more coordinated focus as well by some Antifa members. They are the group that Donald Trump has now designated, or says that the US is going to designate a terrorist organization, a huge huge ramping up of rhetoric from him. But I'd say the vast majority are people that are deeply upset, deeply angry, who feel that they have endured decades of inequity.
Peace on the left. Peace on the left. Peace on the left. Peace on the left. That's what I'm talking about. I understand y'all upset. But like it was already said, I doubt y'all half as upset as I am. So if I'm not over here wilding out, if I'm not over here blowing up stuff, if I'm not over here messing up my community, then what are y'all doing? What are y'all doing? Y'all doing nothing. Because that's not going to bring my brother back at all. It may feel good for the moment, just like when you drink. But when it comes down, you're going to wonder what you did. My family is a peaceful family. My family is God-fearing. Yeah, we upset. But we're not going to take it. We're not going to be repetitious. In every case of police brutality, the same thing has been happening. Y'all protest, y'all destroy stuff, and if they don't move, you know why they don't move? Because it's not their stuff, it's our stuff. So they want us to destroy our stuff. They're not going to move. So let's do this another way. Let's do this another way. Y'all right. Let's do this another way. Let's stop thinking that our voice don't matter and vote. Not just vote for the president, vote for the preliminaries, vote for everybody. Educate yourself. Educate yourself. Don't wait for somebody else to tell you who's who. Educate yourself and know who you're voting for. Thank you for the love. Thank you for the flowers. Thank you for the memorials. Thank you. Now, before I go, I just want to hear this again. What's his name? George Floyd. 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 George Floyd. George Floyd. George Floyd. George Floyd.
You know, the pandemic has been a painful reminder of how unequal America's society is. African Americans disproportionately affected by this and many other health crises. They've watched these police shootings play out far too many times, and I think what we are now seeing is something akin to the LA riots back in the 90s after Rodney King at the hands of police.
Yeah.
You know, they've just had enough.
Yeah.
And it's reached this apex.
Minneapolis looked really raw, Emily, in terms of emotion. Is there anyone you met that stuck in your mind, or anything that one of the protesters said to you that kind of summed it up for you?
Yeah, I think it's really important to distinguish, as Cordy says, between these two groups of people. There's no doubt about it that plenty of people have been opportunistic in the past few nights, and the looting in Minneapolis, New York, lots of places shows that. But as you say, protesters really do care about the issues, the ones, even some of the ones that verged on being violent, but were there because they were so there was so much passion in their voices.
I didn't want to come, and I don't want to be here. I'm the son of an Atlanta City police officer. My cousin is an Atlanta City police officer, and my other cousin, East Point police officer. And I got a lot of love and respect for police officers, down to the original 8 police officers in Atlanta that even after becoming police had to dress in a YMCA because white officers didn't want to get dressed with. And here we are 80 years later. I watched a white officer assassinate a black man. And I know that tore your heart out. And I know it's crippling. And I have nothing positive to say in this moment. because I don't want to be here. But I'm responsible to be here because it wasn't just Dr. King and people dressed nicely who marched and protested to progress this city and so many other cities. It was people like my grandmother, people like my aunts and uncles who were members of SCLC and NAACP. So I'm duty bound to be here to simply say that it is your duty not to burn your own house down for anger with an enemy. It is your duty to fortify your own house so that you may be a house of refuge in times of organization. And now is the time to plot, plan, strategize, organize, and mobilize. It is time to beat up prosecutors you don't like at the voting booth. It is time to hold mayoral offices accountable, chiefs and deputy chiefs. I'm mad as hell. I woke up wanting to see the world burn down yesterday because I'm tired of seeing black men die. He casually put his knee on a human being's neck for 9 minutes as he died like a zebra in the clutch of a lion's jaw. And we watch it like murder porn over and over again. So that's why children are burning to the ground. They don't know what else to do. And it is the responsibility of us to make this better right now. We don't want to see one officer charged. We want to see 4 officers prosecuted and sentenced. We don't want to see targets burning. We want to see the system that sets up for systemic racism burnt to the ground.
You know, we met several who were talking about George Floyd, who were actually, as it happens, really furious about the other 3 officers who have yet to be charged or arrested, who were there when George Floyd died and effectively stood by and did nothing. And actually, the police chief in Minneapolis.
Yeah, I heard that chant, wasn't it? 1 down, 3 to go.
Right, and you know, I think the police chief thinks that silence equates to complicity. So we may see something happen there in the coming days. But the protesters, you know, one of this girl, I met her, she was crying during, by the way, a really stressful moment of rubber bullets, tear gas. We were all running away from the police. It was, you know, highly fraught, and she was just sobbing. And she just, you know, listen to her here, you know, in her voice, there's just desperation. And by the way, this woman is white. She was there with a group of mixed race people, and she just wanted a change.
Yeah.
George Floyd for my community, for my people. I love my community, and these people need someone to stand for them. We all got to stand together.
What does it mean to you to be out here on the streets tonight?
It's starting a revolution right now. We're going to change everything. That's how I feel.
So yeah, I just think that in all the politicization of these protests, and you know, Donald Trump and others have been quick to slam the violence. Nobody wants violence. Nobody gets behind that, even if they are behind all these issues. But there are a lot of people who are really hurting and well-meaning and see their voices as having been ignored for so long that protesting is the only thing they can think to do at this moment.
Yeah, it's despair, isn't it? The endless cycle, the names that keep coming that kind of spark these movements, and the next name comes and proves that nothing has actually changed. Now, the president, such is the political moment that he is the protagonist really in all of this. This is the backdrop of a Trump presidency, which we know is so divisive. And he's kind of been, what's the right word here? I would say quite uneven in his response on all of this is probably a kind way of putting it. He once claimed, of course, to be a unifier. And now he finds himself in the middle of that American carnage that he promised to stop. In his inaugural address 3 years ago, he was taken to the White House bunker on Friday night. He's been stoking the flames, really, calling protesters thugs, using that racially charged phrase, when the looting starts, the shooting starts, which he later insisted was a statement, not a threat. And he's called on his supporters to stage counter-protests at the White House. That didn't really kick off, did it? So you had that speech in the Rose Garden, President Trump declaring himself the law and order president, and basically threatening use of military force if there wasn't tougher action on the ground in the States.
To stop the violence and restore security and safety in America, I am mobilizing all available federal resources, civilian and military, to stop the rioting and looting, to end the destruction and arson, and to protect the rights of law-abiding Americans, including your Second Amendment rights. First, we are ending the riots and lawlessness that has spread throughout our country. We will end it now. Today, I have strongly recommended to every governor to deploy the National Guard in sufficient numbers that we dominate the streets. Mayors and governors must establish an overwhelming law enforcement presence until the violence has been quelled. If a city or state refuses to take the actions that are necessary to defend the life and property of their residents, then I will deploy the United States military and quickly solve the problem for them.
What he hasn't done or even tried to do, and I think it's been very deliberate, is sort of unite the nation in any way or kind of empathize or understand what this anger is all about. And then outside, you have basically protesters being forcefully removed, cleared in ways that were hurting them, in ways that were awful to hear. Just the audio itself of that moment just outside the White House in Washington, D.C. And then that cleared the way for the president to walk. They've made a kind of very Hollywood-style video of his walk across to that church for his photo opportunity. An astonishing theatre, really, that he commanded in a very forceful, brutal way in Washington, D.C. And there's apparently some kind of divide in his administration, or there has been, as to whether he should do a kind of Oval Office address. He hasn't done that. He came here to this church, and I think we've got to talk about that, haven't we? What on earth went on here? Cordy?
Totally wild. In a presidency of many remarkable, jaw-dropping moments, this felt so symbolic of his tenure. With protesters outside, the country in flames, people wrought with grief and anger. He decides to just walk up to St. John's Church, an historic church that's been visited by every president since James Madison, with protesters just 100 feet away from him who have lost all faith in his leadership, and just hold up a Bible, the wrong way up it must be said, in front of the cameras. And
yeah,
it was...
I'm always amazed
kind of
by
one finger up to...
Yeah, absolutely. Just to unity, wasn't it? It was kind of here, I'm decided I'm going to my base. But what always fascinates me, and I think we all sort of think a lot about the palace intrigue, probably more than most, but what was the conversation before that? Because when you actually think about what must have been said, all right, I'm going to go out there because I'm sick of being bunker boy. That's the hashtag that's been created, that he's been hiding in his bunker. But we need to clear them all out of the way, whatever it takes, just get them out of the way. And then I'm going to hold up a Bible. And just the idea that when you actually think of, Emily, the thought process here, because it wasn't just him, was it? He had to have a big team of people supporting this idea and helping it happen.
This is the thing. It's endorsed by his senior staff. This is not a man operating on his own. And you're exactly right. The conversation that must have been had in the Oval Office, like, yeah, I want the optics. This is a man who is a television president. He knows what good pictures look like. And he designed it. But it was just could they not see that clearing protesters out, peaceful protesters, would have such a bad look? And then to go out there and not say anything, one of the things I've really been wrestling with this in terms of Donald Trump's response in the last few days is, who is he appealing to? He came out, and just before that moment we're discussing, he gave his sort of big response, and he declared himself the law and order president. Actually, have a listen to exactly how he phrased that here.
I will fight to protect you. I am your president of law and order and an ally of all peaceful protesters. But in recent days, our nation has been gripped by professional anarchists, violent mobs, arsonists, looters, criminals, rioters, Antifa, and others.
You know, he is a man that wants to show people, show voters that he is in control and he will protect their homes and their livelihoods. Is that working? If you are a person, even if, say, you are a white voter sitting in your home and you're concerned about the safety on your streets and your children's safety, is that message sufficient? Because one thing he has not done at all is pull people together. There has been no empathy shown, and I just can't understand it. What are the strategic comms?
I think it's a political calculation. I think he feels there is more to gain by keeping in his lane, and a divided country will play more to his political MO than if he starts to mouth platitudes and become consoler in chief. I mean, that was the legacy of Barack Obama. He doesn't believe in this grandiloquence that he believes equates to nothing.
He doesn't have it in him. It's not his nature. It's not his instinct. I don't think he is actually capable of doing that. And I think you're absolutely right. It's strategy. And the kind of times we've all seen it, haven't we? Where he's tried to be the uniter. He's tried to go out there and speak. It's always scripted. It's always very flat because his heart's not in it. And when you hear Donald Trump fired up, it's when he's dividing people. It's not when he's uniting people. That's when someone else has written the script and he's reading it off a teleprompter. And you can tell he's uncomfortable in those moments, isn't he?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, he is standing on the side of the police, authority, some sort of order in society, the Second Amendment. He is not wanting to be seen to suddenly be an ally of all protesters. And that is not his political motif, his political personality, the direction he wants to take the country in. And so I think his silence has been very deliberate.
I just guess I
wonder.
wonder.
You say you're right. Go on, Emily.
I just wonder whether there are enough people that are interested in only that to re-elect him, and I guess we will only ever find out on November the 4th morning. But that message is so stark, and the absence of any empathy in his delivery there. I would have thought there are just huge swathes of America who find that very alienating.
Yeah, I'd be interested to know what the supporters made of this one, because as you say, he's the TV president. He has had occasions where he knows how to put on a show. But I think I just think this failed on every level, whether you're looking at it as someone who found it just very unappealing in and of itself, or whether you support Trump. I mean, just the holding up the Bible, read a prayer for goodness sake, say something, just holding it up. I mean, it was way off.
I mean, he's always going to have the, religious Americans, pretty firmly. Certainly he'll always have the evangelicals on side. We know that's a pretty firm voting bloc.
Will he, though? Will he definitely?
But even for them, they'd love a bit of scripture, wouldn't they?
Oh, let's take it back to the days when he talked about the 2 Corinthians.
This took me back to an interview that he did last year, actually, and it must be watched again. I think it was with Bloomberg, and they asked him what his favourite passages were and could he recite them, and he said that he couldn't possibly do that because it was too personal to him.
Because I can't.
And he said, which do you prefer, the Old Testament or the New Testament? And he said, equal, yeah, equal. And this is a man who does not read the Bible. I mean, come on, let's be honest about that. But the fact that he says he does is enough for many evangelicals and many people, and maybe not many, but a certain number of people in America who actually thought that Barack Obama was a Muslim. So Donald Trump saying these things, however cursory, however throwaway, however meaningless, is actually enough for them.
But not enough for the actual Episcopal Bishop of Washington, who was indignant that he should turn up without any warning.
Let me be clear. The president just used a Bible, the most sacred text of the Judeo-Christian tradition, and one of the churches of my diocese, without permission, as a backdrop for a message antithetical to the teachings of Jesus and everything that our churches stand for. And to do so, as you just said, he sanctioned the use of tear gas by police officers in riot gear to clear the church yard. I am outraged.
I mean, I suppose we shouldn't forget we are in DC, and so, it's a liberal city, and I'm sure that applies to the clergy here too. But you're right. The people who ran even that church, let alone the kind of system in DC, didn't know he was coming, didn't know anything about it, are absolutely furious that he was using
planning,
effectively the name of the Lord to kind of absolve himself. It was extraordinary.
Yeah. Oh, we need to take
just a spontaneous act of religiosity.
Yeah, it's just coming right from the heart. We definitely need to take a break. All right. So there is a void that Donald Trump, as president, has created, and Joe Biden is doing his best to fill it. More after the break. Welcome back to Divided States. George Floyd's tragic death was the catalyst that put us in this moment, which feels big. It feels significant. There is so much going on at the moment. And of course, all with the backdrop of the pandemic, the other nightmare that America was living in. People locked up, isolated for weeks, mass unemployment, sickness, death. This is such a mix, isn't it, Cordy?
Yeah, it's just a confluence of crises, isn't it? And I think we've heard a lot in the past week or so. People speak of two viruses that America can't seem to shake: racism and this pandemic. And it's all kind of colliding to make this really toxic whirlpool of animosity and division. And it feels a little like people have been pent up, living in poverty sometimes, certainly struggling to make ends meet, out of work, out of hope, and out of belief in this presidency and their future. It's just reached boiling point.
Yeah, it feels like one situation's feeding the other, Emily.
Absolutely. And I think, as Cordy points to, the sort of the underlying issues of race, and both of these things really come to the fore. I read somewhere yesterday, I think, that half of Black adults are now unemployed. Just think of that.
Crazy.
That is crazy. A huge burden for one community to shoulder. And I just, as you say, it's just kind of like one thing after another that is affecting that community. And you also sense, actually, for what it's worth, in terms of the wider protests, that the 10, 12 weeks now of lockdown and suspension of normal life have had a really profound impact on the way that people respond to stuff. We've all been living under this state of heightened emotion, and I have to think that has something to do with the kind of the level of the intensity of the protests in the last few weeks also.
Amanda, you've been here longer than all of us, and you've witnessed the Freddie Gray moments, Trayvon Martin, all of these flashpoints in America. Do you feel that this one is unique in terms of the level of anger?
It's so hard to know, isn't it? I mean, in those moments that all feel very raw and very powerful, each of those deaths, each of those names, like we've said, they're tragedies and they have these much broader impacts as well. It's really hard to know. But I think with everything else that's going on at the moment, as we've mentioned, the pandemic, Trump's presidency, I think also just the graphic nature of that video.
Yeah.
I think that's contributed a lot to it as well. So powerful and so gut-wrenching. And you hear the people on the street sort of begging these police officers who are just almost nonchalant in the way they are behaving in that way. And so there of course you can understand, and we should all think about what it must feel like to have that hopelessness, to have your son, to be terrified every time your son leaves the house because of what an encounter with a police officer could lead to. And, I think what's been interesting actually to talk to you both about is the absolute difference we've seen in individual police officers, who are, of course, people as well, in how they've responded on the ground here. And we've seen some police officers use force in the most unwatchable way sometimes, which just beggars belief at the moment when you consider what this has all stemmed from. And then you see police officers who are, showing solidarity, and the difference that makes in that crowd in that moment, how it just brings the tension down. It does, doesn't it? And then you've got the president saying more force, dominate. From what you will have both seen, is dominating going to make this better?
I just think I wonder if actually one of the changes that might come from this is that hopefully improved relationship with the police, possibly, because one of some of those viral moments that have really captured our minds recently have been, police chiefs coming out of the stations and going into the crowds in albeit slightly threatening situation. The police chief, the female police chief in Atlanta, coming out and talking to protesters and saying, "We hear you."
Listening.
Police dropping to their knees, listening and and almost joining the protests. I think that can have a really positive, powerful impact in America if indeed it continues.
Yeah, I mean, the fact remains, though, if you look at the figures, deaths by police have actually gone up since Ferguson, a moment that we'll all remember so vividly in America. There's actually pretty scant, reliable, comprehensive data around this, but a Washington Post database that recently came out stated that African American people are twice as likely to die at the hands of police than white people. God. And what it feels like Donald Trump has opted for is this sort of Nixonian law and order rhetoric, ideology that certainly appeals to a base and a kind of core Republican value, but that doesn't speak to the moment of a changing electorate. I mean, if this becomes the election when we have a more diverse selection of voters, and certainly we've seen in some of the candidates that people want Biden to push further to the left to represent the America and get someone as his VP that shows a more modern America, a deeply diverse one, then it could be very tricky for Donald Trump. I just don't know at this stage, I guess.
I think one of the most worrying questions in all of this is, would we be here had that video footage not existed?
Yeah.
And we probably wouldn't, would we?
I doubt
it's
it.
not the event itself that has caused this. It's the recording of it in the most, I mean that in the most kind of practical sense, because it's happening when it's not being filmed, and it's happening with a frequency that is not really understood, I don't think, is it?
Well, I think that the outrage wouldn't have come, but all black people know that this is happening to their people all the time. Like, I don't think as a nation perhaps, but I think that
video, I think it's been really interesting. I've had people contacting me saying, I've just watched that video from different angles and a kind of forensic breakdown of what happened to George Floyd, and they're sort of viscerally shaking at what they've seen. It was the kind of protracted nature as well, his slow and painful death that just ignited people, I think, in a way perhaps we haven't had access to quite as much imagery before. And it's quite striking that only 28 of the biggest 100 police departments in America have actually banned chokeholds. I mean, chokeholds are still a hugely controversial tactic.
And for what it's worth, all of these cops are wearing body cameras, so they know they're on film, and then they behave. Perhaps they forget. And I don't know what the psychology is there, but they are on film and they should behave accordingly.
What do you make, Amanda, of the post-mortem debate? Because you had the official one that said he didn't die of asphyxiation, then the family commission their own, which suggests that he did. I mean, surely public lose faith in the authenticity of the official report.
I know, and it's just like you apply that to everything now, don't you? Interpretation of something. We're kind of in this post-fact world, and people take from moments like that what suits their own pre-existing argument. But I think, we've obviously got the absolute extreme end of that video, and then we've also seen other videos that are shocking, not as devastating in terms of their consequences and their outcome, but the woman in Central Park.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, that got a lot of people talking, didn't it?
Well, absolutely. And I think what's interesting is when you put it in the context of everything else that's happened in the last week. I watched Trevor Noah give a kind of speech about this, if you like, on Instagram, which I thought was really interesting. Him talking about the dominoes that might have all fallen onto each other to create this moment of huge national outrage. And watching that video.
Just remind everyone of what the woman did.
Of course, a woman named Amy Taylor, who was a white woman walking her dog in Central Park in New York. She was asked by a black man to put the dog back on a lead to follow the rules. And there followed a moment which the guy captured on his mobile phone, which showed her sort of trying to get rid of him, but then basically use a call to the police to try and create trouble for him in order to protect herself. And what was really interesting is the tacit understanding that she had, that she could weaponize her skin color and her relationship with the police, which is to say that they trust her account of what has happened more than they would trust that of a black man, that she could weaponize that in order to get this guy into trouble. I just thought that was such a stark moment of the way the relationships we all have with the police, the way we understand the power of our own skin color or the lack of power you have from your skin color. And it
was a superiority moment, wasn't it? It was like, I mean, I've had those moments in the park with the dogs. You know, there's a lot of people, I'd say particularly in this city, who like to tell you to put your dog on a leash. And, you know, it's one of those moments that happens in normal life, but it went to this extra level in that situation where she, as you say, had clearly decided that she had the power
she could get away with it.
The skin color situation. Well, there is this notion, isn't there, for things to change. Like we're probably all much more prone to these judgments than we would dare admit, and for anything to change, that people have to look at themselves. And as we said at the beginning of this, I think a lot of people are doing that more now, looking at our own identities, our own judgments that we make, and the role that everyone can play. I mean, that former President Obama has been saying, if this is going to bring real change, everybody has to play a part. And there is this sense, isn't there, that it's the black community need to start, you know, pulling up their trousers and, you know, sorting this out. And of course, that's not the way to solve this. And it has to be a collective, unified response. But can that happen with the guy who's not too far away from me right now in the White House in charge? Big question for you there.
Well, I think that it's been really interesting, as you sort of alluded to earlier, to see Joe Biden's response. America has been waiting around for a couple of days for this kind of big speech from Trump to unify the country. That came from Joe Biden today on Tuesday. He gave a speech that kind of had the rhetorical flourish of the Obama days, so perhaps at some of the same staff there, and really spoke to bringing the nation together, healing the wounds. And obviously it was a pitch for his own presidency, don't get me wrong, he's motivated there, but I found it quite soothing, truly. You have a listen to it here.
You know, I know there's enormous fear and uncertainty and anger in the country. I understand. I know so many Americans are suffering loss of a loved one, suffering economic hardship, wondering, can I feed my family tomorrow? What's going to happen? Suffering under the weight of a generation after generation after generation of hurt inflicted on people of color, on Black, brown, and Native communities in particular. Like many of you, I know what it means to grieve. My losses are not the same as losses felt by so many, but I know what it feels like when you think you can't go on. I know what it means to have that black hole in your chest where your grief is being sucked into it. Just a few days ago marked the 5th anniversary of my son Bo's passing from cancer. And there's still moments when the pain is so great it feels no different than the day I sat in that bed as he passed away. But I also know that the best way to bear loss and pain is to turn it into that anger and anguish into purpose. And Americans know what our purpose is as a nation. It has to be guided. It has to be guided. It's guided us from the very beginning. You know, it's been reported the day that President John F. Kennedy was assassinated, little Yolanda King came home from school in Atlanta and jumped in her daddy's arms and said, "Oh, Daddy," she said, "now we're never going to get our freedom." Her daddy was reassuring, strong, and brave. He said, "No, don't worry, baby. It's going to be okay. It's going to be all right." Amid the violence and fear, Dr. King He persevered. He was driven by his dream of a nation where justice runs down like water and righteousness like a mighty stream. Then, in 1968, hate cut him down in Memphis. 2 days before Dr. King was murdered, he gave a final Sunday sermon in Washington, where he told us that though the arc of the moral universe is long, he said it bends towards justice. And we know we can bend it because we have. We have to believe that still. That's our purpose. It's been our purpose in the very beginning, to become a nation where all men and women are not only created equal, but they're treated equally. Not just created equal, but treated equally.
Because there is such an absence, isn't there, Cordy, of that kind of language, which, you know, you could argue, is it going to make much difference to this really complex situation that is dogged America for so long? But as you say, I mean, it's kind of soothing. It's nice to hear that, even if it doesn't change anything.
Yeah, it sort of just calms things down a little bit. It's what people hope and expect or used to of a president. A moment of pause, some reassurance, some oversight, a bit of optimism. But I would say people expect and will demand much more from Joe Biden than an eloquent, soothing speech. I mean, his own record is being really challenged at the moment, particularly by young African Americans. You know, it's only a couple of weeks ago that he did an interview that went viral that he was slammed for, where, you know, he is suggesting you're not truly black if you vote for Donald Trump. I mean, a lot of African Americans feel that they are being taken for granted. Having said that, of course, his political record, particularly with older African Americans who more typically vote in larger numbers, is good. It was the turning point, wasn't it, in the election, in the primary battle, when he started to do well because of some of the endorsements from the likes of Jim Clyburn, a very prominent African American politician. But he's got to be pretty careful himself.
Yeah, you know, one of the things I think is really interesting is the kind of hold that Joe Biden has taken over that relationship with the Floyd family. He's spoken to his brothers, George Floyd's brothers, at length, I think, in the last few days, and has talked about, you know, the way that they're suffering to some of his supporters since. And actually it has been announced that he's going to go down to the funeral in Houston next Tuesday, and you can sort of sense him trying to reach not just the Floyd family but the wider African American community in that act, and going, I think, to try and be something of a healer. You know, there are obviously political points to be scored here too. He's running for president, but it's an interesting move, and I'm sure will infuriate Donald Trump.
And he's good at that. He's good at that, isn't he? He's kind of had his own, sorry to interrupt, Don, he's good at that. He's had his own personal tragedies. He knows how to connect with people on that level. And as we were talking about before, I just don't think Donald Trump is capable of that, because he would love to score points in that way, I'm sure. But I don't think he has it in him.
For what it's worth, I actually, regardless of your politics, I think that in this moment we would have heard a similar speech that we heard from Joe Biden today from George W. Bush. I don't think that this is a political thing. I think it's about the man, only men. This is about the man that we're talking about here.
Yeah.
Do you think, guys, that there is any element of kind of positivity here? That there is genuine hope of us being on the cusp of change?
Hard to feel it right now. I mean, I think the enormity of it suggests a little bit of optimism that maybe this could be big enough. But, you know, these moments do feel big when you're in the center of them. I think the crucial thing, you know, we've heard from cultural leaders, from kind of big names, big voices within the African American community. It's about sustaining it, isn't it? It's about this moment enduring. And I don't know who's got the answers for that. You know, it's hard to say how, with this presidency, this moment can kind of evolve into something real and practical.
this is vague, but my hope is that there's something going on with the younger generation. You look at the way that, those Obamas, those Oprahs are trying to communicate with the generation, couple of generations behind us, on Instagram, on social media. They're trying to empower them to make a change. And perhaps it will come up from those people who are growing up now rather than people who have already been making decisions. There's hope there.
Yeah, it's been interesting seeing how, white privilege as a phrase has been echoed time and time again over the past few days, and you hear it so much in the crowds. I mean, yesterday I saw them pamphleting every car in sight of the White House, getting people to check their white privilege. Is whether that kind of gets galvanized into a movement that starts making real practical change. It's hard to know, but it's definitely a moment of reckoning.
Yeah, and it's still very raw. That's it for this week. You can follow us all on Twitter with the latest from the ongoing protests. I'm at Walker Sky News.
I'm at Cordelia Sky News.
And I'm at Emily Purser.
Divided States is produced and edited by Chris Scott, and Becky Cottrell is our producer here in Washington, D.C., and Emily Upton in New York.